as a faithful Jew, Daniel would have taught the law of God to these magi or these magicians and sorcerers and enchanters and all that kind of stuff. He would have made sure that among all the other writings they would have had to read the law of God. Hi, I'm Dr. John Neufeld, and you're watching Back to the Bible Canada. I am delighted to have you join me in this series that I'm doing called Why Christmas, and we're looking at every single one of the Christmas events that we've taken for granted, and we just simply say, well, it is that way because it's that way, and asking the question, why of everything? I've been using the analogy of kids who, say why this, why that. There's a comedian some time ago that had this, very funny shtick that he did, why is there air? And that's kind of the idea of, the kind of questions that kids ask that are kind of unanswerable. And so we learn to say to kids, well, just because. And my point has been that sometimes when we recount the Christmas story, maybe we've heard it so often, and, why is this there and why is that a part of the story? And then maybe the answer just, well, it's because that's how it is. And I'm trying to go back and recapture that childlike wonder about Christmas and ask around every single detail, why that? And so today, I want to ask the question, why the Magi? Why is that a part of the story, and what does that mean, and how significant can that be? Well, so at the outset, let's ask the question, because I think when I ask the question of why Magi, let me answer it right at the start and say this. The answer to why Magi is because the Magi tell us that there is a universal hunger for God and for his sending of his Messiah into the world. It wasn't long ago, and somebody told me a story that apparently, they had just heard very recently, and this is a kid who's having a conversation with his grandma. And so he says to his grandma, and so he's a little kid, and they've driven by a building, and he has, no Christian background whatsoever. And they saw a church, and he asked what that building was. And his grandma said, it's a church. And he didn't know what that was. And he said, so what is that? And so his grandma, searching around, trying to find an answer to that, says, well, that's where people go when they want to learn about God. And the kid his wheels were turning. And he said to his grandma, I want to go there because I want to learn about God. You see, we shouldn't be surprised to hear people from the most unlikely backgrounds saying exactly that. And they're not just, the people that you might expect. Because the story of the birth of Jesus happens in Israel, and yet we find people journeying from places where we wouldn't have expected, and they journey to see the Messiah. So the answer to why Magi is because Magi tells us something about the reach of this Jesus, who would in the end not only reach the lost tribes of Israel, but also would reach out and to the lost people of the entire world. So that's where we're going. And in fact, Isaiah chapter 60, verse 3, speaking about the Messiah, says, nations shall come to your light, kings to the brightness of your dawn. Indeed, that's what we begin to see happen in the Christmas story. So, okay, very good. Let me read the account of the Magi, and this is taken now from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. So that's the story that we have that's there. Now, this unlikely gathering of people, and I'm going to say that includes these wise men, at least that's how they're called here in the ESV version, which is the version that I tend to read from, the English Standard Version. They translate that as wise men, but it also has the king of the Jews, who is Herod. It has the chief priests, and they gather together, the scribes and those who were the leading theologians of the place, and all of them gather together to answer the question that these wise men come to ask. So that's the setting of the story. It brings together this unlikely group of people. I'm going to come back to that because that makes a part of the very interesting part of this story. Now, I know that, I've said that, my translation says wise men. And, there are others that have simply thought of these individuals as three kings, they say. And there's even a hymn like that, "We Three Kings of Orient Are," and so forth. But I'll tell you with almost complete certainty, these men are not kings. So, that's a misleading element that we sometimes add into the Christmas story. And so I'm going to burst a couple of balloons as we think about who these guys actually are. But however, let me take you to Matthew chapter 2, verse 11, which says that, the Magi, in fact, I'll read it to you. It says, "And going into the house," it says, "they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense, and myrrh." So let me burst a couple of bubbles, if I will, or some of the illusions that we have around Christmas. First of all, nothing in the scripture says that there were three of them. We don't know how many there were. There might have been quite a troop. Maybe there were as many as 20 of them. We just simply don't know. And they didn't offer three gifts. They offered to him gifts, says Matthew. And the gifts were of frankincense and myrrh and gold as well. And so, however many gifts there were, those were the elements that the gifts were made of. So we don't know how many there were. The second thing that I want to point out, just so that we get the story correct before we go into the details, is that a lot of people, especially at Christmas plays in the church, you've got the shepherds showing up and the wise men, and they all gather around baby Jesus in the barn. That most certainly didn't happen that way. The shepherds came first, and they were long gone by the time that the wise men or the Magi showed up. And I'll show you why, because Matthew 2 verse 11 says, "And going into the house," it says. That is, they didn't go into a barn, they didn't go into a cave. That's where the shepherds went. By the time these guys arrive, Mary and Joseph have moved from that barn or cave or wherever it was, and they've moved into a house. And when the Magi showed up, they were actually in a house, which leads a lot of people to say, well, how much later did those guys actually show up? And the answer might be that they showed up perhaps months later. I know that there are some people that say they may have shown up 2 years later. I think that's very unlikely. The reason people say 2 years later is because Herod gives a decree that all the boys 2 years and under should be butchered. But please remember that Herod was a very cruel man, and he just wanted to make sure he gets them. He doesn't care how many boys are butchered. He just wants to make sure that in the butchering of the boys of Bethlehem, in the murdering of these children, that they would get the Messiah as well. He doesn't want a king to be a rival king to him. So, that's why some people say they showed up 2 years later. Well, I don't think it was 2 years later. I think it's very much likely that when Jesus was born, a star appeared. These guys saw the star. They gathered people together, and then they came to Jerusalem. And so that might have taken, let's say, a couple of months. And that seems a much more likely scenario to me than the other. And so let me also say that, again, they're not kings, but they're something else. In fact, the original Greek uses the term Magi. And that comes from a word from which we get our English word today, magician. And it's here that I think we can begin our story and tell about who these people actually were. I think the most likely answer to who they were comes from the book of Daniel. Now, to be clear, Daniel's written some 600 years before Jesus comes onto the scene. So by the time Jesus is born, Daniel is already an ancient book, 600 years old. But in Daniel chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "So the king," that is the king of Babylon, the great superpower in that day, "summoned the magicians and the enchanters and the sorcerers and the astrologers to tell them what he had dreamed." So there are actually 4 groups of advisors, and magicians and sorcerers and all these people, they make up different groupings of people, but they are all counselors to the king. And the king has got a dream. He takes that very seriously, so he calls the best people that he has. And the magicians were a group of the four people. They belonged to the priestly class. They learned the sacred writings of the occult, and they specialized in conjuring up spells. So by the time of Christ, everything had changed. First of all, the Babylonian Empire was no more. Babylon had been sacked. It was done because already, the Babylonians, they were defeated by a group of people called the Persians, and the Persians had the next empire. The Persians were defeated by the Greeks, and the Greeks were defeated by the Romans. So empires had come and empires had gone by the time these Magi showed up. So please don't draw a direct line from, the magicians before the court of Babylon to these people. However, I think it is likely that even though the people that surrounded the court of the king of Babylon, those people were no more. I think it's likely that some of their magic arts and some of their wisdom thinking, some of their ways of philosophizing, that had been handed on through the generations. And so instead of having four separate groups of people, all of that kind of, if you call it wisdom, was packed into one group, and this group was called the Magi. They were probably people who were interested in astrology, in magic, in books that were thought to contain mysterious references on the future. Some of them were undoubtedly liars, cheats, and charlatans who were using this to make as much money as they could. Some were no doubt in an honest search for truth, but nonetheless, this is who they probably were. Now, before I go any further, let's also remember that the Bible condemns that kind of activity. So if I go all the way back to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 6, it says, if a person turns to mediums, and wizards, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among the people. So this is not, an activity that God condones. And in fact, whoever these people were, they were certainly a part of a wisdom group, if you call it that, but that was condemned by the Bible. And what's interesting as well is that when Isaiah's time came to be, and Isaiah prophesied against this group of people, he prophesied the day of Babylon's disaster, and I'm reading from Isaiah 47, verses 13 and 14, speaking to Babylon. Here's what Isaiah says. You are wearied with your many counsels, king of Babylon. Let them stand forth and save you, those who divide the heavens, who gaze at the stars, who at the new moon make known what shall come upon you. Behold, they are like stubble. The fire consumes them. They cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. No coal for warming oneself is this, no fire to sit before. By the time Babylon is ruined, it becomes clear that all the wisdom that so-called that came out of this group was absolutely no good. In the end, these people were exposed for what they were. They were charlatans and cheats and had led the king astray and certainly couldn't deliver the king in the day of trouble. Isaiah foresaw that was going to happen, and surely that is what happened. So when Babylon fell, Daniel the prophet had predicted the fall of Babylon. None of these magi had done so. They had been ineffective. Daniel, God had discredited them. Well, a third thing that we ought to know about them as a group also comes from the book of Daniel. And let me take you to Daniel 2, verse 48. And it says, Then the king gave Daniel high honor and a great many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon, over all the magi of Babylon. So in Daniel's day, he was raised, he was promoted, however you want to think about it, over all of these people. And then all of these people were answerable to him. Now, you have to imagine that some of them were very jealous of Daniel, and some of them would have wondered how in the world a Jew and a faithful Jew could have risen to a higher standing than theirs. They would have no doubt plotted his ruin, all of that kind of stuff. But perhaps some were also influenced by them. And I have no doubt, as a faithful Jew, Daniel would have taught the law of God to these magi or these magicians and sorcerers and enchanters and all that kind of stuff. He would have made sure that among all the other writings they would have had to read the law of God. And if that's true, and I assume it is, Daniel would have shown them the book of Numbers, chapter 24, verse 17, which says, "A star shall come out of Judah, a scepter shall rise out of Israel." See, Daniel would have told them that the entire Jewish faith looks forward to the great Redeemer, one who is called the Messiah, who comes to deliver people from sin. We are awaiting that, he would have told them. One day a star will rise out of Jacob, that is, out of Israel, and that star will in fact, give life to not only Israel, but to the whole world. So somehow I have to imagine that teaching of Daniel was incorporated into the magician's wisdom notes. And so they would have studied all sorts of stuff, and that would have been a part of it. And so I'm only trying to paint a picture that one day, a company of these magi, who probably lived somewhere in what was called Iraq today, they would have seen a star, and the men would have looked at that star and would have seen it to be unlike any star they had ever seen before. And because they were this kind of people, they would have said, the star surely has some kind of spiritual significance, and they would have studied their literature and their text to say, what do we make of this, and what wisdom can we ascertain from it? And they might have come to the conclusion from Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, a star will come out of Jacob. And so they came to the conclusion, this is what Daniel the prophet left us. This is the sign that the great Messiah, the greatest king the earth has ever seen, has just been born. And if you believed that, and they surely did, they would have said, well, what do we do about that? And their answer is, well, we load up our camels or whatever else we've got, and we head our way towards Jerusalem. And so that's the whole idea behind that. So I'm gonna burst another balloon here in just a second here and just simply say, the way that some of us tell this story, it almost sounds like that they're following the star to Jerusalem, but they're not. They've seen the star appear. They've had a discussion. They say, what does it mean? And they say, it must mean that the great king of Israel is born. We're going to make our way to what other place do we go to but to Jerusalem and search for him and find out whether or not this is in fact the case. So that's the background to the story. And that in itself is fascinating. So having said all of that, the results of them showing up now in Jerusalem and making immediate inquiries. Where is the one who is born King of the Jews? We have seen his star. It's appeared to us. We've studied our texts and our books. We know that Israel has just produced the great King of the world. Can we go? Can we worship him? Can we bring him the gifts that we have? And so that's the answer to the question of how in the world, using stargazing and all sorts of magic arts that are condemned in the Bible, these men found their way to Israel. And the answer is they found their way because within all of their stuff, they also had that kind of stuff going on. So at any rate, the point I think I'm trying to make is that when God draws people, he doesn't draw them from, neat, clean, upright backgrounds. Jesus, throughout his life, drew tax collectors and prostitutes and Roman soldiers and a Syrian Phoenician woman, people from all manner of shady backgrounds, less than ideal. They're the people that are drawn to him. And I'm going to say that's still the case today. I mean, people whose lives are basically in order, who don't view themselves as sinners and as wretches in need of salvation, they don't make their way to Jesus. The people that come are the people that are the most outrageous and needy and from the most unusual backgrounds possible. That's how the Christian faith got going. Nonetheless, so the Magi show up, and so I've said that what happens here is that we bring together this unusual group of people. And the first one that we hear mentioned is that Herod the king is told about this, and he calls the Magi to him. Now, Herod is an interesting man because if you read through your Bible, there are a number of different kings who are all called Herod. This is the first of them. He's also called Herod the Great. He was made king over Israel by the Roman Senate in 40 BC. He was not a Jew. he was an Idumean, and an Idumean is a descendant of the Edomites that come all the way from Esau, if you know that story. But he's not a Jew, and because of that, the Jewish people never liked having that kind of a king over them. They didn't accept him well. Herod, if you know anything about him from history, he is two things at the same time. He is at one hand brilliant, and at the other hand as evil as they come. Brilliant and evil, not a good combination. But if you go to Israel today, you're going to see still the ruins of all sorts of things that he built. Right along the Mediterranean Sea, there's a city called Caesarea. It was built by Herod. They actually poured concrete underneath the ocean floor. And were able to make that congeal with a form of concrete that we still haven't been able to replicate to this very day. The man was brilliant. He's the one that built the temple in Jerusalem. You know, I mean, there's a lot of other buildings that you can go to. In fact, if you go to Masada, which many people do when they go to Israel, it's just one of the, wonders of the whole place there. You go to Masada up in the mountain. That was actually built by Herod the Great. He was the great builder and the architect of some of the most splendid buildings that you're going to find there. Now, that's true, but Herod is also a man who's incredibly wicked. We know that because he was seeking to ingratiate himself with the Jews and to get a better following, he took a Jewish wife, and then when he no longer felt he needed her, he promptly murdered her. And then he had two sons from this woman who complained about the death of their mother, and so he promptly murdered those two of his sons as well. He removed any high priest that he thought not worthy to the office or wasn't loyal enough to him at a whim, which was against the law of God. So nobody liked him. In fact, he even had one of the high priests murdered. And it was Caesar Augustus who said of Herod, he said, "It is better to be Herod's pig than it is to be his son." That's how he treated people. So, when you get to the point where he's murdering the boys in Bethlehem, that's just nothing for Herod. I mean, to murder people who are in the way is nothing. He doesn't care about human life or about the value of anybody's feelings or about the value of their life. He doesn't care. See, it's told that when Herod lay on his deathbed, now watch this, that's perhaps a year after the incident with the Magi, that it occurred to him that the Jews would be celebrating his death, so he had his men, his soldiers, gather together the leading Jews from the city of Jericho, and he confined them under guard. And the guard was told that the minute they got word that Herod had breathed his last, that he had died, that these men were to be slaughtered in Jericho so that the Jews would mourn and not celebrate when he died. I mean, that was the kind of a wretch that he was. So Herod's this very brilliant man who's very intelligent and cruel beyond belief. And you think he'd notice if a group of these magi that had come from the region of Iraq and said, "We have, through our magic arts, assumed that there is a great king of Israel who's just been born, and here we are in Jerusalem, could you tell us where he is?" Do you think that Herod would care about stuff like that? Oh, yes, he would. Immediately, I mean, his ears are up, and he wants to know, if that's true, I'm going to kill this kid the very minute I find out who he is. Now, of course, nobody knows where he is. And so Herod brings together, and it says, the chief priests. Now, technically, there aren't chief priests. There's only one chief priest at any one time. But, for instance, in the United States, when you have, a president who has sat as president, and now he's a past president, but he's still alive, you still call him President so-and-so. In the same way, that's what they did in Israel. You'd served as chief priest. You're no longer the chief priest, but you're still called the chief priest. So he brings everyone together who's ever served in the office of chief priest. Now, if you know something about the chief priests, at the time of Herod, the chief priests were all from a discipline within Judaism called the Sadducees. And the Sadducees were an interesting group of people. They only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible. They didn't believe in the others. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, nor even the promises of the coming of the Messiah. I mean, perhaps they did, perhaps they didn't. I mean, that's not clear to me. But however, the Sadducees, because they didn't believe in an afterlife and in a judgment, any of that stuff, they were this worldly oriented. And because of this worldly oriented, they're always looking how to ingratiate themselves and line their pockets and become powerful and wealthy, and they were. So they get news that these guys show up and said, the great king of the ages has been born. They're as interested as Herod is because those guys don't want to lose their position of power. Now it says they also brought in, the teachers of the law. Now the teachers of the law were not Sadducees. These were Pharisees. And the Pharisees, these were people who were very concerned about keeping the law of God and doing the things that God required. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees deeply mistrusted each other. They were suspicious of each other. I think it's not an overstatement to say they hated each other. So, but yet all these people are gathered. Herod, the psychopath ruler, the chief priests who are, doing anything that they can to increase their own power, and then the Pharisees, who are, fundamentalists and who are, concerned that the law of God is being trampled on. And these people come together and they're being asked a question: if the Messiah were to be born, where would he be? And the answer is, well, he wouldn't be here in Jerusalem, because they get out the prophet Micah and they say he would be born in Bethlehem. And in Bethlehem is the very place where King David was born. He would be born over there. So what an amazing meeting that must have been, as these people who were all suspicious of each other were looking at each other. And that brings us back to the question: why Magi? What does God try to communicate to us when, in fact, yes, the Magi may have come for all sorts of nefarious reasons, but it was clearly that God had brought them there, and all of that excited this outrage in Jerusalem in which the entire place is talking. So I think in order to understand the answer to the question of why the Magi, I think what we need to do is to go forward to the time when Jesus is an adult now, and he is ministering in his life. And one day he decides to take his disciples from the region around the Sea of Galilee, and he moves them all the way up north. It would have been a couple of days of walking to a place called Caesarea Philippi. Now, I know that when you read the Bible, you see these names, and they don't mean a lot to us. But let me explain to you something very significant. Caesarea Philippi was a pagan center in Israel. It was a place where there were a great many pagan temples. The largest of them was a temple to the god Pan, who is a god of shepherds, but also a Greek mythology god who plays the flute and all sorts of other things. And there was a place of sacrifice right there in that temple in which they would sacrifice these animals and throw them into the water, and the water would be filled with blood, and people would call that place, that water body right inside the temple, which went down into a cave, they would call it the gates of hell. And so Jesus takes them to the place of Caesarea Philippi, and he takes them all the way there to ask them a question. And the question is, who do men say that I am? And the answer is, well, some say that you're John the Baptist come back to life, and other people say that you're one of the prophets of old, and so forth. And so they go through all the list of possibilities and everything that people have been saying about Jesus already. And then Jesus says, but how about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter steps forward and says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus turns to Peter and says, I tell you, it wasn't flesh and blood that revealed this to you. In other words, this idea didn't come to you in your own thinking, but it was revealed to you by God. And he says, you're Peter, and on this rock. And it's fascinating, the question about what does Jesus refer to when he says this rock. But since all of the temples in that area had been built on the stones above the area, it's quite likely that Jesus was saying, and on this rock, that is in the place where these pagan temples are built, where sacrifice is made to the various gods and goddesses of the pagans. On this rock, in the middle of these pagan temples, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. I will take my gospel into the heart of the most unlikely places on earth, and I will erect my temple there. So in a real way, that is the story of the Magi. Who would have believed that such an unlikely group of people should show up to worship the Christ child? No one would have believed that could have happened. And that's the meaning behind that story. From the very outset, Jesus was drawing people that are from the most unlikely places. And when we talk that way, I have a marvelous story to tell. Years ago, I studied under a man named Dr. Walter Martin, who in his day was known to be an expert about cults and the occult. I was a university student before I met him, but he was coming to the city in which I was studying. And I went out to see him because in that day he was quite well known. He did his meetings in a very large building that held several thousand people, and the place was jam-packed, filled with both Christians and non-Christians from the university. And I remember very well because there was a question and answer time where people would go to a mic in this large place, and they would ask him questions, and he would answer. And the first person to the mic that day was a university professor who was well known for his criticism of Christians and his belief that the Bible was filled with contradictions. He was the first guy to the mic, and I tell you, everyone in the room recognized him, and they all thought, now this is going to be very interesting. And the first words that came out of his mouth was this: I mean, do you think that witchcraft is wrong? And Dr. Martin said, yes, it is condemned in the Bible. And the professor said, well, if that's the case, why is it that the people that are drawn to Jesus are the people that, they see a star by their witchcraft and they come to worship? So clearly there's syncretism in the Bible, and you're just wrong. Well, Martin, just without even hesitating, said, no, you've not read your Bible correctly. These people saw a star, and from their magic arts, they assumed a great king had been born. They came to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, they didn't know where he was. And so then they contacted the theologians, and the theologians got out their Bible, and they said, this is where you're going to find him. No, it wasn't that they discovered him through their magic arts. They were led to the theologians. And in fact, that's exactly what we see here. These individuals, drawn to the belief that there's a great king that has been born, are with theologians who in fact hate each other, but they know enough to know Scripture and say, he is actually in Bethlehem. And then something miraculous does happen, because in Matthew 2, verse 9, it says, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came and rested to the place where the child was. In other words, somehow, maybe there's a shaft of light, I don't know, but it leads them to the very house where Jesus is staying. I can only imagine that day when there's a knock on the door, Mary or Joseph, or maybe the both of them, come to the door and they look out and they see the most crazy looking, unlikely group of magicians and astrologers and people that delve into the magic arts and everything that's condemned in the Bible. And they stand at the door and they say, we understand that the King of the world is right here in this house. Could we come? Because we long to fall before him and worship him. What a moment that must have been. And I wonder what Mary and Joseph actually thought. Would they have known that Herod in his rage was going to look to kill the child, and that shortly after the Magi left, that they would become refugees going to Egypt, trying to save their lives and the life of their young boy that had been born? They would not have known that yet, but they did know that something remarkable had happened. And why Magi? Because the Magi signal to us that when Christ came into the world, he came to draw people from every race and culture and language and people group and religious background and experiential background and everything else that makes the human family. Jesus came to stretch across all of the divides of people and make an impact on their lives. So why Magi? Well, the Magi tell us that the gospel of Jesus is for everyone. Jesus has come to seek and to save those who are lost and to bring them to himself. So if you're listening to me today and you're the person that comes from a very different background than would typically you would think belong to a Christian church or to a worshiper of Jesus, please understand this. From the very outset, Jesus has been drawing people just like yourself. Don't think it's so unusual that you find yourself attracted to him, that you long to bow before him and worship him as Lord and God and as the only hope in this world. The Magi led the way. Follow them and go all the way and worship the Christ child. Why Magi? Because it tells us of the nature of the revolution that Jesus had come to bring. What a glorious story theirs brings, and what a message of hope it is, not just for some, but for the whole world. Thanks for being a part of Back to Bible Canada today. God bless you. Wishing you a very, very Merry Christmas. May God's favor rest on you. Thank you for watching today, and I want to ask you to make sure that you hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel so that you can receive any further notifications of all the videos that we prepare for you. Thank you so much for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada.